Back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So the last video I recorded was a video about partitioning Illinois. So I'm going to do that now for the state of New York. So if we go into Google Maps, you'll obviously see that New York has a lot of large cities: Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Albany. Obviously, all along this up here in northern New York, western New York. But then obviously we know about New York City, and New York City is different than Albany, and New York City is different than Syracuse, and different than Rochester or Buffalo. So the question then becomes, do we make New York City, or do we make the greater New York area its own state? And I think maybe the easiest way to do it is just kind of cut New York that way. Like, that might be like the easiest solution. Like, you have northern New York, you got Albany, Sarasota Springs, all of western New York, including Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, its own state. And then you make the Hudson River Valley, you make New York City's boroughs, Long Island its own state. Like, that might be like the easiest. You just cut it in half. Like, that might be a way. Or if you want to just make Long Island its own state, and then you have the other boroughs in New York City, Brooklyn, Queens goes to Long Island. You then have Staten Island, could then go to Jersey, or I don't know. Like, Staten Island, I hear, is, obviously I've never been to New York City, but I hear Staten Island is kind of like the redheaded stepchild. So maybe no one wants Staten Island. I don't know. And then you just have the other boroughs just go to New York State. Honestly, I think the easiest, again, is just, chop it in half. But I don't know. Last time I checked, I think there was like a movement. It was a small movement, but there's people on Long Island that want Long Island to be its own state. You could just make New York City its own state. You can just have the 5 boroughs be its own thing. Or you can divide New York into like 3 or 4. You can have New York City, Long Island, and the Hudson River its own state. And then you basically have like western New York be its own state. Maybe include Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. Maybe this be its own state. Western New York be its own state. Northern New York be its own state. And then the Hudson River Valley, New York City, Long Island be its own state. Like, you can chop it up in multiple different ways. Again, the easiest is probably just that. But that's just my take on it. Obviously, you can even divide it into like 4 or 5, or I don't know. It depends on, like, New York City could be its own, Long Island could be its own, the Hudson River Valley could be its own, and then like northern New York, western New York could be its own. Like, you can divide it up multiple different ways. Kind of like in my last video, I talked about how I took just Chicago and a little bit of Northwest Indiana and made it its own state. This video, pretty much, obviously we can divide it up so many different ways, but I honestly, the easiest solution is probably just a line from Pennsylvania's border all the way to the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. Like, that's probably the easiest. But you can divide it up in so many different ways. So you can divide it up into 10 different ways if you really, really want to. Like, Buffalo, Rochester could be its own. Syracuse can honestly be its own. Northern New York, Albany, you got Hudson River Valley could be its own. The boroughs of New York City could be its own, and then Long Island could be its own. So there's multiple ways you can partition New York. An infinite amount of ways. But that's kind of how I would do it. Obviously, there's plenty of states around the country where you can totally partition it off. Like, I obviously have talked about Chicagoland area, talked about New York. I'll probably talk a little bit about California also, maybe a little bit of along the West Coast. But yeah, that's kind of how I would partition New York. Just chop it in half. Hudson River Valley, New York City, Long Island be its own state. And then Northern New York and Western New York its own. So, but again, you can do it so many different ways. So that's my video. Thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next one.